Hi, I'm Dylan Does. I am the lead pastor of Restore Church.
Hi, I'm Greg Spurgin, and I'm the lead pastor, church planter at Crossroads Community Church in Moxie.
Hi, I'm Curtis Bell, and I'm the lead pastor at Yakima Valley Community Church.
And I'm Steve Kraft, and I've had the privilege of knowing these gentlemen for a number of years.
Steve, why don't you set the stage for us? I candidated out in Yakima to become the lead pastor in June of 2008, many moons ago. Would you kind of set the stage for us of what was going on at Yakima at that time?
Well, 2008 was a real transitional year for YVC, Yakima Evangelical Church, which is now Yakima Valley Community Church. But the pastoral search committee had asked Dylan, and I believe did Aubrey came as well.
Yes.
For that, and I'm sorry.
And our 7-month-old Ian.
Okay, and Ian. And so there was the interview took place, and my thoughts at the time was, we have a 26-year-old man that is wanting to candidate for this pastor position, and we're going to have to grow up another pastor. And the church was hurting. We had gone through some difficult waters at the time, and the thought that I had is that if God brings him, we will support him. And that was kind of in the process of asking some questions. I had two. What was Dylan's most important relationship? And it was God, then his family, then the church. And how many hours did he take in a week to prepare for a sermon? And it was basically 16 hours at the time. That was the answer. And I was impressed, because here's a young man that desired to walk with God, and he had his relationships right. And so that's where we started.
I will clarify exactly what Steve said. Was when they said a 26-year-old was coming out, I said that's a terrible idea. But if he does come, Elaine and I will support him 100%. That's the actual phrasing.
Well, there you go.
Curtis, you had the second longest time served in Yakima through generations and generations. Kind of tell us where you and your family were at in 2008.
Yeah, YEC at the time had always been home to me, and yet our family, we had been struggling for a while, dealing with a number of things that were going on in our family and in our hearts. And we had, at that point in time, made the decision that we were going to be leaving. So we already had it in our mind that our bags were packed, and really we thought we knew where we were going to be going at the time.
And then Greg, you and Marnie had been a part of the community for a couple years, and God was shifting some things in you. So why don't you tell us where you and your family were at in June of 2008?
Yeah, so I've come to find out that God does crazy things in me in the midst of the most craziest moments of life. Church was, like Curtis and Jacqueline, they were preparing to, kind of step out, and we were, partially engaged in church, just basically kind of coming on Sunday and going to life group. But God had just, like, in a moment, just grabbed my heart, and I made just kind of a transformational moment to Christ in that moment, and just said, I'd serve you wherever you lead me, wherever you send me. And like just right after that, we got the notice that our youth pastor was leaving, and plus we were just looking at Dylan as a as a candidate for the church, and God just said, I want you to step into youth ministry. Then I'm like, that's crazy. We have a 26-year-old pastor who's 4 years younger than me, and no youth pastor, and like why would I even step into this? And so that moment of like, okay, I mean, I guess I said yes, so whatever this looks like in the future, that's what 2008 looked like for us.
And for my wife and I, we were just wrapping up our first pastorate, and I had an elderly lady who would always give me good wisdom. And before we were prepping to fly to Yakima, she said, God told me that you should pray for the mountains and go wholeheartedly. So as my 24-year-old bride, my 7-month-old firstborn, and I flew from SeaTac in Seattle and hopped the Cascades in a small plane into the Yakima airport. I looked down, and it was just the foothills and the mountains going into Yakima, and immediately we knew this is where we're supposed to go. And God gave me Jeremiah 6:16, a stand at the crossroads, and I asked which way is the way to go, and God says, look to the ancient paths and walk in them. And that's a rough paraphrase, but the reality was, okay, this is home. And as you look on the screen, and this is the team that God gave me, and very thankful for. But and over the next 6.5 years, God did some things that I didn't know was possible. But it all started with the 4 people you see on your screen and some others, but it was this complete devotion that God wanted to do something if we would just be obedient and do it. And real quick, I'd just like to hear it for a couple seconds out of you. What was a confirmation for you guys to know God is up to something? I'm going to start with you, Steve.
Well, I was amazed. I'll be honest with you, when Dylan and I came, and Ian, and the ministry began, and changes began to happen in YEC. Territorial issues were dealt with. The word of God came forth. Lives were transformed. Then I began to always had this thought in the back of my mind about Curtis. Curtis needs to be in the pastor. There was never a doubt in my mind from the high school years that we were involved with him, and even until today. And then to see Greg and Marnie step up and how God was using them, and then his heart began to change. We saw that, and then we come to find out that Dylan's heart was being pulled to Marshalltown. That was kind of but it was all done in a manner that you didn't doubt it. You began to see that God was working, and he was orchestrating. We were just a part of it.
Yeah. Well, and Curtis, I'd like to know, first part, when did you know that God was up to something within Yakima, within YEC at the time? When did you know, like, okay, this is where our family needs to be, this is how we're going to invest here? And small groups ministry really was where your bread and butter was for the most part, early on anyways.
Yeah. The first confirmation that God was doing something was the message that you gave Dylan out of Jeremiah 6:16. And I didn't want to be there that morning, which is the real ironic part about it. And I was talked into being there by my dad. He said, you got to come once. He said, you got to come here, Dylan. You're going to love this guy. You're going to love his heart. you guys could be great friends if you just came and listened. And I was very resistant because, like I said, we already had our minds made up. And we came that Sunday morning for that service. And I felt like we were at a crossroads in our family's life. And I felt like I knew where we were supposed to go, but I had wanted so many things for our church over the years. And I just hadn't felt like we had been going the direction that I was really sensing God stirring in my. And when Dylan gave that message that Sunday, I was in tears by the end of the service because it spoke to every area of my heart that I had been sensing at the time. And I believe I went to you, Steve, after the service was over, and I said, "That's what I've been waiting for." And and from there, that's the confirmation. I knew that God wanted us there, and that we were going in the right direction. And so we had a talk as a family and just prayed and confirmed that together. And then, like you said, from there, figuring out where our next step in the ministry was into a small group ministry, and which we had been doing in different capacities. And that's what really cemented my relationship with Greg and Marnie and their family. So there's a lot of neat things that God did, but it all started at that moment.
Yeah, that's awesome. For many of you don't know this story, but Greg, Curtis, and I went to seminary together. And in the first year, I think it was 09, the fall of 09, I dropped Greg off at his house, and Curtis and I were driving. And I said, "Curtis, I am here as long as it takes for you to be ready to be the lead pastor at YVC." And
Wow.
and it took another 5 years, but that was, so to confirm what Steve said, it's the moment I met him, I knew that I was just there as a bridge for the next thing. So that was a very cool moment. So Greg, how about you? How did you see God kind of when you knew at Yakima that God was up to something?
Well, at first when I stepped into youth ministry, I stepped in with a heart of just like, I'm going to hold it all together. And I jumped in with just kind of this idea of, like, I'm just the glue that's going to stick these kids together and keep them together in youth ministry. Because, there was a core youth group of about 25 kids that were coming that were just like me when I was growing up. So I got kind of passionately involved in just serving those kids. But what changed for me in the church was when we started meeting together and talking about community and talking about bridging our lives from sitting in church on Sunday morning to the community outside. And I started serving and started connecting the kids to the community. And I remember the first time Sunday morning, we were talking about, I think it was just previous to an Easter, we were like, how many people are going to be in church this Sunday? And we started praying over the sanctuary. We started praying for the people that were coming. And man, my heart just came alive for new people coming into the church. And I would wait on Sunday morning with anticipation for what God was going to do that Sunday morning with the people that we had come in contact with the week before. So I was at that moment, like I knew that there was a spark of something that was new and different. And I was excited to be on board with that.
The first story and Greg and I worked together every day for 6 years. So we have lots of stories, but the first story is I had been a pastor for like a week, and he has me by like 2 days of seniority, and I get a call, and he's like, "All right, the van is stuck on the beach, but no one's hurt." And like, "Wait, what?" He goes, "Yeah, we took the van out on the beach by the Pacific Ocean, and it got stuck, and the tide came in, but no one's hurt." And I was like, "Oh no." And so that's just the first entry into what do you do when the youth van almost gets taken out into sea. And little would I know that's just kind of par for the course when you're friends with Greg Spurgin. But one of the things is that's kind of what we saw. In over 6 years, I think we saw growth in leadership Steve, you were very important. That's why we always called you our pastor of wisdom. You had seen life a little bit further than us, and you were married to the best person we know, Elaine. And as we started to see things go, but Greg, Curtis, and I, we all grew in our ministry, went through seminary. We got some of our credentialing, and you could tell that God was starting to think about, how do we split this? How do we grow this? How do we make sure this keeps going? And Greg and Curtis and I were in a church planting class, and Greg started to get this thing spinning for, all right, I think I'm supposed to plant. And then Curtis, actually, Greg, would you give me a succinct understanding of when you knew Crossroads needed to be something?
Yeah. So as you said, we were in seminary, and we were in a class on church planting, and I thought, the entire time I was in seminary, my thought was, why am I even here? Like, what am I doing? I'm not a lead pastor. Like, I'm a youth guy for life. And that was like my heart. I thought that was what was going on. And then we're in the middle of this church planting class, and they start talking about strategies and how to plant churches. And it was like this life, just fire became so evident in my life. And I just started to just passionately fall into what is it to start a new work of ministry? What is it to start a new work for the kingdom? What is it to reach people that haven't heard the gospel for the gospel, like for Jesus, and to see that group of people come together and form a heart and become a church and really start to grow together in the midst, and to spread the gospel even farther and farther and farther. And this idea of just expansion just became a part of my soul. And so in that moment, I kind of went quiet with it for like a couple of months, and I started approaching people and talking about the call that I was feeling. And then after a while of really solidifying it, I approached Dylan and said, hey, I'm not trying to cause a church split or try to do anything. Like, I want to be on board with you, and I want you to be on board with this idea, and I want us to move together in this process. And we started praying together, started seeking the Lord, and really started to look at what God is doing. And we both moved along in the same line as we came in sync with each other in the midst of that.
Yeah, and one of the things is, as you started talking about that, Greg, is I quickly knew, as essential as Steve and Elaine were for us early in ministry, I couldn't think of anyone better to send with you. That firm thing is, when you plant churches, you send the best people, right? You send those that are going to help ensure that God's will is done and carried out through the modeling of obedience. So I looked at Steve and Elaine and I said, I'm trying to get rid of you. I'm done with you. You need to go away. No, I said, Steve and Elaine, I think you guys are supposed to go with Greg and Marnie. They did not agree initially, but Steve, I'd love from your perspective of, when did you know you were supposed to go with Steve and Marnie, or with Greg and Marnie?
I tell you what, we did struggle with that, and I was teaching a Sunday school class, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Part of my gifting is teaching, and I knew that would probably end. But when Dylan asked us to pray about it, that was kind of a sneaky way to say, hey, you guys are going to go. And we accepted the fact that and we loved Greg and Marnie. There was no doubt about that. But we felt that kind of like this is completely out of our territory. I mean, this is something that we'd never been involved in, really. And to even consider it, it had to be a God thing. It definitely had to be a God thing. So we did go, and we began to watch God move and do things that only He could do.
And in the process,
That's about it.
Crossroads was planted September 28th, 2014, which was actually my 33rd birthday, best birthday present of all time. But in the process of Greg planting and me seeing, oh, as a lead pastor, I'm sending, very quickly, God said, no, I'm also sending you. So we knew in July 1st of 14 that we were going home. And for us, we knew that this was the time God had told us, yeah, you need to go, and this is what I have for you. 2009 kept ringing in my ears, like, okay, you're here as long as it takes for Curtis to be ready. Now, Curtis and I disagree on what ready means, but I remember,
yeah,
I've never been afraid to tell people God's will for their life. So in August, had lunch with Curtis, and kind of that shift to telling him I was leaving and that I thought he was getting ready to take over. So Curtis, why don't you pick up your story there?
Yeah. So that was one of the craziest years of my entire life. And it was interesting because we had finished up seminary in the spring of 2012 and spent a couple of years wondering what God was going to have next for my life. And so we'd been seeking God on some things and been trying to be open to hearing from God, but there was a lot of fear in the idea of what that next step might look like. But it was June of 2014, 2 months before Dylan came to me, that I was sitting in a service, and it was the first time I really have ever heard God audibly speak to me. And God said, look at the flock that I have given you. And this is as people are standing and singing, and I'm just sitting there and I'm looking around like, what just happened? And so I whispered to my wife, I said, did you hear that? She goes, hear what? I said, and so I wrote the words down. I'll never forget it. And we had a conversation about that. And then after the service, I went and approached Dylan, and I couldn't wait. And you know, you don't want to approach the pastor right after a service to give him like really big information, but I really could not sit in my seat and handle it any longer. So I went and talked to Dylan, and what a weird conversation to have with the person that is the lead pastor at the time, to tell them that God has just told you that you're supposed to pastor this church. Yeah. And so we talked about that, and his response was just, I've just been waiting. And yep. And so we had a neat conversation that day. I had no idea that it would only be 2 months later that Dylan would come to me and say that they were preparing to leave. And it was really interesting to see how God works in hearts, and he can work individually for a bigger and greater purpose. And I had no idea that Dylan had already been processing this with God months earlier about the idea of planting, and then came to that conclusion in July. But God was already working in his heart when I came to him, and he was working in mine. And that's just how God puts things together. And what a great confirmation to be able to stand upon.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, God had dropped hints that we were going to plant, but it didn't make sense until July 1st and looking back. So when you told me, it made perfect sense, but it wasn't like, oh, and now we go. It wasn't until that July 1st and God said, no, you got to go. And I was like, oh, okay. But that was one thing I remember, and I want to wrap up with this. I remember Greg and I fervently praying, could there ever be a time where we would have 100 people in church? And the week we prayed that, I remember looking at the attendance after that, and God had given us 102. And I just remember, like, I had never been filled with God's graciousness more than that. In that 102. And then 2 summers ago, I traveled to Yakima, and I was walking in the back of the sanctuary, And God said, remember when you were praying for 100? Now look that I made 3 churches that serve over 400 people a week. The way that you think about numbers is not the way that I think about numbers and impact. And that was on the 10th anniversary of us moving out there and the stories that we talked about. But now as we sit at 2020, Steve is in New Mexico. Curtis, you are pastoring a newly named Yakima Valley Community Church, but has the history that permeates all 4 of our souls. And Greg, you were pastoring Crossroads Community Church of Moxie, and here we are in my hometown pastoring Restore Church. I just want to conclude with, it's been an incredible honor to be on this journey with all of you gentlemen, and looking forward to the service we get to share on Sunday. God bless you guys, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Dylan.